So yeah, the poisonous logic of seeking, normalizing, and joining coalitions with bourgeois politicians. Well, I'll be mostly speaking on the Dutch situation with the Dutch Socialist Party and our own factional work within the Dutch Socialist Party. I have chosen not to get into the history of the discussion about coalitionism dating back from Marx, the Second International, Popular Frontism, and onwards. But I'll be mostly drawing from the experience we've recently have had. So some of this might be a little bit anecdotal. Maybe to start, it should be clear that the Dutch Socialist Party has no connection to the Socialist Party in Britain. Some people sometimes get a little bit confused by that. Well, why am I speaking on the Dutch situation? It's not because the Dutch situation is particularly special, but mostly because there's recently been a substantial confrontation where the question of coalitionism became central to the conflict. It's also important because this issue with these kind of left-wing parties is, especially in Europe, more common than the kind of conflict you would have in a labor type party. I'm not aware if there's any parties like Labour anywhere else except in Britain. So again, the Dutch experience is not particularly special, but in fact, whenever a radical left working class party gains any size, the question of participation in coalitions with bourgeois parties inevitably comes up. As we have seen recently, or somewhat recently, with Rifondazione in Italy, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and it's also right now becoming a question for the in Belgium with the Party of Labour, which has a very similar history to the Dutch Socialist Party. Well, before I delve into the Dutch situation, I should probably define a little bit by what I mean when I talk of coalitions. And there's really two types, which are of course connected. But the first type is really long-term strategic alliances with bourgeois forces. So our own position as Communist Platform, which is an organization I am part of in the Netherlands, holds a position that while individuals of the capitalist class can be won over, and at times this even could mean larger groups of individuals from the capitalist class can be won over to the cause of working class self-emancipation, strategic alliances with sections of the capitalist class are really impossible without sacrificing the politics of working class political independence. This question of strategic alliances or long-term strategic alliances hardly ever comes up in debates within these sizable left of social democracy parties like the SP, like Syriza, mostly because these parties tend not to think about questions of strategy at all. So what is more common is the politics of short-term coalitions, alliances, agreements, arrangements that still sacrifice party principles or align the party to the nation states or bourgeois parties. Now, this is sometimes more clear than others. I wouldn't say that, for example, anytime you vote with a bourgeois party in parliament, this necessarily means a sacrifice of principles. So when we talk about questions like principled opposition, it shouldn't mean just vote against anything. For example, years ago, there was a struggle in the Netherlands about the Sunday opening of shops where middle-class petty bourgeois forces were against it because they couldn't compete with a larger capital, and they just couldn't do it. And the working class also resisted these Sunday openings because it would sacrifice their weekends, longer working weeks, etc. It wouldn't be unprincipled to vote in the same manner against Sunday openings, for example. The same is true for some democratic proposals in parliament. For example, I know the Dutch Socialist Party has sometimes voted with the Conservative Party, VVD, on issues like opening the books. That's not a sacrifice of principles. It would be a sacrifice of principles for the bourgeois party, and it goes against their own class interest. While we would say that open democracy, opening the books, would be in the interest of the working class. So it doesn't necessarily mean that voting with a bourgeois party always means a sacrifice of principles. It is, of course, more clear when it comes to more principled matters. Well, for example, voting for imperialist intervention clearly means sacrificing working class independence, sacrificing internationalism, aligning yourself to the bourgeois nation state. So yeah, these are the two types I mostly want to focus on when we talk about coalitions. So long-term strategic alliances, and also these more short-term coalitions. Of course, these short-term coalitions also tend to turn into a long-term strategy for these parties, because they don't think about strategy in the way of long-term taking of power of the working class. The strategy of electoral alliances, government coalitions tend to become the strategy. Yeah, so let's go into the Dutch situation. I will start with a little bit of context about the Dutch electoral system. I won't go into it too long. What's important here is that in the Netherlands, there's a low election threshold. So there's a lot of smaller parties, there's a larger amount of parties, there's also proportional representation, so there's no district voting, so it's there tends to be more parties, especially in recent years. So coalitions are quite a normal facet of Dutch electoral politics, where it would be less normal in Britain, or, for example, the United States, or any nation with more two-party types or three-party types electoral systems. So yeah, the Socialist Party. I'll go into a little bit of the history of the party itself. It started as in the late 60s, early 70s as one of the many Maoist sects at the time. So it was never a party of the type that we would aspire to have. Over the years, they mostly distinguished themselves by doing a lot of local work, not going into the questions that much that were normal in other Maoist organizations or other left organizations at the time. So they had quite a workerist attitude. So they would mostly say that although this is a bit myth-making as well, like right now they would really claim this history as being the history, but they mostly focused on local activist work within working class neighborhoods, and had their own union, which was very sectarian to the union dominated by the Party of Labor. And they were involved in local municipal councils. They tried to get into the national parliament a couple of times. They mostly failed. This changed in '93. So in the late 80s, early 90s, the Communist Party collapsed, which always had a position in the national parliament. And it collapsed into more or less Euro-communist organization, together with some Christian left-wing parties, very small, and the pacifist Socialist Party. And they formed Green Left, which was substantially to the right of all these parties that formed it. And this was also at the time that Labour was shifting to the right. So this spot that opened up within the electoral situation was filled by the Socialist Party. It's not quite clear why the Socialist Party was the one to fill the spot. They were always a bit larger than other left-wing parties at the time. For example, the Mandelites were at quite a decent size. So they probably would have been able to make a run for it, but they didn't. And so the Socialist Party claimed that, those seats, and they broke through in '93 with 2 seats in parliament. At the time, it was really, their slogan at the time was vote against. So it was really quite clearly that they wanted to position themselves as a party of opposition to New Labour, to neoliberalism, they would say. So it was clearly that they wanted to position themselves in this way. Along with this, in the early 2000s, the party started opening up with letting other radical left groups into the party. And they also moved away a bit from their previous Maoist sectarianism. So before, they would always be very separate from social movements. And in the early 2000s, they started to get involved with the anti-war movement, with the anti-cuts social movements. And also this really solidified their position as a party of opposition. This also goes along with their campaign in the early 2000s against the EU constitution, which there was a referendum at the time, and they had a leading role in organizing this referendum and the campaign. And out of that came a real parliamentary breakthrough in 2006, where they gained 26 out of the 150 seats in parliament. And they also became larger than the VVD, which is the Liberal Conservative Party. And the party grew to 50,000 members. So it was a party of a decent size at the time. From this, the question of coalitionism started to come up. I'll go into that a little bit more in a little bit. But the party started shifting to a politics of coalition. Mostly on a municipal level, they would form local governments, for example, in Nijmegen. And really, since then, there's been a steady decline of the party. At the current time, the party has about 28,000 members, so well, was slashed in half membership-wise, and it has currently 9 seats in parliament. So before it had 26 in 2006, that was their height, and currently it has 9 seats in parliament. Ironically, this makes it the largest party on the left at this time. So Party of Labour has also 9 seats, but a little less votes. Green Left has less votes. So it's the largest party on the left, which is not a title to be proud of in any way. It mostly shows the shocking state of the left in the Netherlands. And over the last couple of years, it still had the policy of forming local, municipal, on province level coalitions. And we've seen a clear direction towards like nationalist, chauvinist politics. This was always part of the culture of the party, but it has been becoming more clear in recent years. So very much against the European Union, very much against migrant workers, etc. there in the period 2006 and now there has been some moments where they actually gained a lot in the polls, but then lost at the last moment. So, for example, 2012, the party leader was really being popular, and we saw him being like slandered in the bourgeois media. At one point, right-wing magazine pictured on their cover, they pictured the party leader covered in blood with like a chainsaw, and they had like the message there. If Roemer, which was the leader at the time, gets into government, we're moving to Switzerland. Unfortunately, they didn't. So going into like, how would we characterize a party like this? The party has been traditionally split along the lines of parliamentary politics on the one side and the activist leadership of the party. Both have always been very much against party democracy. So the parliamentary faction pretty much ignores whatever the membership says, and the activists mostly have the position of you shouldn't talk so much about all these political questions. Talking about politics is parliamentarism. Democracy and education of your members makes the party into a talking shop or a glorified reading group. So they very much use the activist, the party of activists position to undermine democracy. In recent years, the parliamentary tendency has gotten the upper hand. They kind of shoved out the activists out of the party leadership. This was mostly due to disappointing electoral results. They more or less decided to, or saw their opportunity to take power within the party. And really, if we look at the party structure, it's clearly not like Labour, like your analysis of Labour. It's not a bourgeois workers' party. Like we have characterized it as a mass sect, because it's very much still has the complete structure of your traditional left-wing sect, very undemocratic, very much like the Maoist organizations of the 70s and 80s. And it's a mass sect because it's gained a lot in membership. So yeah, that's a little bit about the party history. There's much more, of course, but I won't go into that too much right now. Maybe we can during the discussion. So yeah, this conflict recently started last year. This year we've had elections, and of course the campaign started last year. And last year the party parliamentary leader went against previous statements of the party, saying we will not go into any coalition with the VVD, the Conservative Liberal Party. And she said, we are ready for government. We are willing to form a coalition, even with the VVD. At first, this didn't really spark that much controversy. As I said, since the activist side of the party, they will probably be against it, but their education level is so low, and their willingness to organize is also very low. So they didn't really go against it at all. So most of the opposition came from our group, but we are a very small group. So there wasn't really that much opposition to it. Until the youth organization of the party, Rood, which means red, passed a resolution to speak out against the ambitions to form a government coalition, all government coalition, to be clear. And this really led to an overreaction of the party bureaucracy. So at first they threatened to cancel the funds of the youth organization. They threatened to take offline the website of the youth organization if they would publish any such statement, since the resolution said we have to openly speak out against it. And after that, they decided to blame the youth organization passing this resolution on Communist Platform, which is our organization, saying that we had taken over the organization, that we formed a party within a party. Well, you all know the phrases they use. And this led to a couple of expulsions. 5 comrades and myself got expelled from the party, and since then we've been in a battle with the party bureaucracy. They also expelled 2 candidates for the leadership of the youth organization, and which were members of ours, and the youth organization decided to ignore the expulsions and still let them stand as candidate, and they got elected as chair and member of the leadership, which has now recently led them to severing ties with the youth organization at all. So the youth organization is more or less completely kicked out. And we, of course, decided to keep on running the youth organization. So the youth organization is still alive and kicking. Well, really, this shows partly that they are afraid of the left, but we shouldn't overstate this. We shouldn't overstate our forces. It's mostly a show of force towards potential coalition partners, that they are willing to purge left-wing elements out of the party if necessary. What is interesting is how the left in the Netherlands has responded to this. So a lot of the left really refused to deal with this question at all. And they mostly refuse to acknowledge that this is a discussion over class independence, over questions of coalitionism. So, for example, the International Socialists, which the Dutch SWP, mostly tried to frame it as a conflict between the youth organization and the party leadership, and more or less try to make it into a conflict, like a generational conflict. It wasn't a political conflict, it was all about the youth against the old people, the activist youth against the bureaucratic leadership, another question of politics. The Mandelites have criticized the consequences of coalitionism. So they would say the inhumane policy towards refugees is the problem, but they haven't criticized the source of this problem, which is the attitude the party has towards class collaborationism. And then there's, of course, the NCPN, which is the equivalent of the CPB here, who hasn't acknowledged the struggle at all, except saying that, well, it was kind of a third period response, like these are social democratic enemies and you shouldn't engage or try at all within these organizations. And part of this is also because acknowledging these questions of coalitionism really means that they have to engage with their own politics, which usually tends to be sloganeering for a left-wing government, or the pop frontism of the International Socialists, where they also want like their small campaigns with like bourgeois groups, religious groups, celebrities. So talking about coalitionism would, of course, mean they would have to seriously think about their own politics, which they aren't really prepared to do. Well, yeah, let's then look at the consequences of seeking coalitions with bourgeois parties and politicians. And these will be some more general points. I think they mostly go for any left party that falls into this trap. It's important to say that seeking coalitions, as the title does, because the policy of coalitionism without actually forming coalitions is just as harmful, as it tends to have the same effects. Well, the first point I would make is that this policy of coalitionism necessarily means that party democracy is circumvented. To enter into these coalitions or try to enter into these coalitions, they have to abandon a lot of the left politics that the membership have agreed on within the party. Thanks to WikiLeaks, we saw, for example, documents leaked from the American embassy from 2006, when the party gained a lot of votes. And at the time, it was, well, they were just coming out of the anti-war movement. And also they had a program about NATO was agreed upon at the Congress, where they said we have to leave NATO and we have to abolish NATO, which is standard stuff. And of course, after the victory in the 2006 elections, they tried to find coalition partners. So they went to the American embassy, the party leadership, and they basically told the American embassy, we're not that much anti-NATO anymore. We're not anti-American like we used to be. They even said, we appreciate the shared US-Dutch values and could not imagine a Dutch government abandoning the transatlantic relationship. Like, it's all terrible stuff. Of course, in the same WikiLeaks document, it also shows Frans Timmermans, who's now the first vice president of the European Commission, and he rejected outright any possibility of forming a coalition government with the Socialist Party. Timmermans stressed that to hint at such a possibility would alienate large numbers of centrist voters, both within and outside the Party of Labour. And in his view, it would be foolish for the Party of Labour to trust anyone who used to be a communist. And this is just one example. We see this again and again and again, that party principles are circumvented. Another part of this party democracy being circumvented is that it tends to have the dynamic that parliamentary party politicians get increasing power over the party. We see this in the Socialist Party, where slowly parliamentary party politicians have even more power than the central committee of the party, and outright go against decisions by the central committee or by the Congress. And since there's of course no possibility of recallability, they can just do what they like. Another result, and what I've hinted upon with the expulsions we faced, is that to be a reasonable coalition partner, the bourgeois parties tend to demand of a party that they clean up house. So they ask, or sometimes they don't even ask, it's more pressure from the media, or it's just the party bureaucracy being very willing themselves to jump on this opportunity to purge leftist or revolutionary elements within the organization that damage respectability, and also would harm the willingness of bourgeois parties to join a coalition with the left party. And generally, the party bureaucracy chooses to purge these harmful elements, either by undermining democracy. So, for example, a lot of the left within the Socialist Party just walked away at the first sign of struggle, at the first sign of undermining of democracy. But if that doesn't work, they choose to expel, go for bans on factions, which a Socialist Party doesn't formally have, but of course they do ban being a member of another party. So that's how they came up with the party within a party stuff. Another issue is that the party tends to use bourgeois institutions like the bourgeois press and the state against the left. Of course, we saw this during the First World War, where the right wing of the social democracy used the state against the anti-war sections of the party. This didn't really happen, as far as we know, at least so far, in the Netherlands, but they have very much used the bourgeois media against us. So they would slander us with things like, these are radicalized ethnic communists. They want to wage violent civil war. At one point, a big right-wing website had a picture of me up with enemy of the state. And this was all given to them by the party bureaucracy. And of course, the bourgeois media is very willing to jump on these accusations and use them. So we had like weeks of stuff about this in the media, and still going on whenever something happens with the youth organization. Another problem is that respectability becomes the yardstick by which the program is measured. So it's no longer, the program is no longer based on any strategic vision, like Marxists would say. Of course, the minimum program would have to mean the abolition of the bourgeois state and replacing it by a democratic republic. Well, the Socialist Party, of course, never said any such thing. They even moved away from more respectable party positions. For example, in the Netherlands, there's also the issue where it's customary that parties send their program to the Central Planning Institute, which is a state office, and the Central Planning Institute calculates what the effects of your party program will be on the economy. Well, one can predict the outcome of such institutions looking at your program. It will always be you have to cut wages, unions are bad, and so on and so forth. And we have always opposed this, and we've always called for boycotting this game. But the party very much uses coalitionism as a stick to beat the left with, saying, well, if we don't send it to the Central Planning Institute, this will mean that nobody will want to go into government with us because our program won't be realistic. Next point would be that the effect of or the consequence of this policy of coalitionism diminishes the character of the party as one of opposition. And this also means that it just isn't appealing anymore for most working class voters. because it really becomes a party that isn't distinguishable from normal social democracy or bourgeois parties. Usually this gets solved by either just accepting this as fact and becoming a left capitalist party. But what we've also seen is that the Socialist Party tries to then move to like a national chauvinist program to try to win votes from the populist right, and taking over this rhetoric from the populist right. This usually doesn't work because if people want to vote for the populist right, they will go for the real thing. But it's also interesting that the party will always frame these things as nationalism is just popular with workers, so we have to be nationalist. And they also use that as like a stick to beat the left. So they would say, well, you're for the working class people like this. This is the mass line, is what they say in the Socialist Party. Some good old-fashioned Maoism. But it's a real problem, and I think it's telling of the state of the party, where it has seen such a steady decline that being anything else than a party of opposition just doesn't work. Last point I'm gonna make is that, and there's many more points, and I'm sure we can go into that during the discussion, is that the party will integrate the undemocratic state structure and undemocratic nature of a lot of these social reforms into the party. So, for example, what we saw with the Dutch Party of Labour, and I'm sure it's similar with the SPD in Germany, the Labour in Britain, that it's takes over this politics of managerialism. In Dutch, we have the word alderman socialism. In the Netherlands, alderman is a member of the municipal executive. Mobilizing among state functionaries, ministers, etc. And they really, this becomes a nature of the party. So that's a real issue, and that also really undermines the power of the working class over their own parties. So yeah, that's the last point I wanted to make. And I want to quickly go into how should the left then deal with these politics of class collaborationism. I heard something during Kevin's talk earlier. He made a point about the left calling for a labor government to then prove that government participation is limited. I think this is clearly a dead end, because joining a government or joining a coalition has these consequences on the nature of the party. So calling for a left-wing government to then say, see, government participation doesn't work, that's a dead-end politics. It will just have the effect of destroying your party. I would also say that we cannot mend the schism between class collaborations and bureaucratic bourgeois elements within the party or within the workers' movement and the revolutionary left. That's really only possible if we would sacrifice the politics of class independence. This also means that we cannot depend on, for example, the Socialist Party alone, because it still has these elements. It means we have to build up independent meetings, organizations, factions, our own press to fight this battle. And we we should move away from the abstentionism that has plagued a lot of the radical left, where they just withdraw themselves within their own sects and say we don't want to fight this fight within these parties. But I think, especially because they have such a place within electoral politics and within society at large, that we cannot ignore these institutions, however problematic they are, since they also, however contradictory as it is, also provide a basis for a future class independent communist party of principled opposition. So we have to fight the battle within these parties. However you do it is a matter of tactics, whether it's completely in or completely out, or one or partially in or partially out of the party. That's all tactics, but we should go for open confrontation with class collaborationism. I'll leave it at that.